This is the man who defied the impossible by faith.
Picture an ancient world, majestic, feared, ruled by kings and priests who claimed they held the power of destiny. A world where gods were shaped by human fear and where heaven had been silent for generations until among the thousands bowing to lifeless idols, one man rose without a map, without a plan, without certainty. He heard a voice no one else could hear and chose to walk a path that the world would call madness. Who was this man brave enough to abandon everything for the unknown? What gave him the courage to trust in a God no one had ever seen? And why, after thousands of years, do Jews, Christians, and Muslims still trace their history back to his name? Get ready to discover the untold truth about the man who changed not just his generation, but the destiny of nations. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe and activate the notification bell so you never miss any of the hidden and life-changing stories from the Bible. Now get ready. The journey is just getting started. The voice that broke the silence. Genesis 12. The sky over of the Chaldeans always looked the same. Fixed stars, distant, untouchable. In that place, time seemed to move slowly, carried by the sound of prayers to gods shaped from stone. From childhood, Abraham had learned to bow before them. His father's name, Terah, was known in the marketplaces and city squares. The family prospered, and no one dared to question the gods who guaranteed their wealth. But Abraham, he felt something was missing. Days repeated themselves like an empty chant. Sarai's hands, his wife's touch, were his only silent refuge. Sometimes she looked at him as if she could see beyond. But not even she could fill the emptiness that haunted him on sleepless nights. What lay beyond the walls of beyond the known roads, beyond the promises of the priests? One night, while everyone slept, Abraham went out. His steps took him to the top of a hill outside the city. The wind felt different, heavier. It carried something he couldn't explain. And then the voice came. It wasn't like the chants in the temple. It wasn't like the whispers of the priests. It was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was alive. It was strong. It was personal. Abraham. His name was spoken as if heaven itself knew him. His body trembled. He fell to his knees, not before an image, but before the invisible. The voice continued, "Leave your land. Leave your father's house. Go to the land I will show you." Abraham's heart pounded. What was this? A delusion, a dream, a trick of the mind. But the sound was too real to ignore. Promises began to fill the air. "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. Your name will be remembered among the peoples. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." Abraham opened his eyes. There was only the wind and the sky. No image, no statue, no shadow, only silence. After the promise, he returned home in silence. He lay beside Sarai and stayed awake until dawn, staring at the clay ceiling. When the morning came, he called his father. Terah received him with the weary look of a man already carrying the weight of age. Abraham explained that he would leave, that he would depart from, that he would follow a voice no one else could hear. Terah looked into his son's eyes as if reliving old pains. Deep down, he knew this day would come. Without questions, the old man nodded. Abraham gathered Sarai and Lot, his nephew. Caravans were prepared, animals loaded, servants lined up. The whole city watched them leave as if witnessing a meaningless madness. The desert awaited them. The invisible called them. The first step was taken. Abraham didn't know what he would find. He didn't know what he would lose, but something inside him told him there was no turning back. The journey into the unknown had begun. The departure that broke the heart. Genesis 12. The sound of ropes being tightened around bundles of luggage echoed through Terah's courtyard. Servants hurried back and forth, organizing jars, tents, skins, and dry food for a journey no one could understand. Sarai watched it all in silence, her gaze fixed on the city walls as if she was saying goodbye to every stone, every path she had known since childhood. "Where are we going, my lord?" she dared to ask. Abraham didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he simply didn't know, was all they had ever known. It was where Sarissa's parents lived, where her friends had grown up, where their dreams had been built. Leaving it was like tearing away a piece of their very souls. But Abraham did not hesitate. There was something in his eyes Sarai had never seen before, a strange certainty, as if he carried a secret no other man knew. The people of the city gathered to watch the caravan depart. Some shook their heads in disapproval. Others whispered that Abraham had lost his mind. Terah, with tired eyes and trembling hands, walked up to his son. He held Abraham's face in his hands and in silence blessed him. There were no more words left to say. Lot, Abraham's young nephew, tried to hide his fear with false excitement. "The desert is vast, uncle, who knows? Maybe we'll find cities even richer than." Abraham just smiled, knowing the treasures he sought were of a different kind, invisible to the eyes. As the city gates disappeared behind them, Sarai looked back one last time. Tears streamed silently down her face. She pressed her fists to her chest, trying to hold back the pain. The scent of earth seemed to follow them as the sun scorched their first steps toward the unknown. Days became a routine of dragging footsteps in the hot dust. The nights were cold and filled with strange sounds, the howls of animals, creaks in the dark, the wind rustling through the tents. Sarai, always by Abraham's side, felt the fear growing. "What if we're wrong?" she whispered on some nights. But Abraham always replied the same. "The voice made me a promise and I cannot ignore it." Their stops in small villages along the way only raised more doubts. Wherever they passed, they were seen as strangers, as people with no direction. "Where do you come from?" they were asked. "Where are you going?" people insisted. But no one had an answer. Sarai began to wonder if this promise was even real or just madness Abraham had embraced to escape the monotony of it. In her heart, she wanted to believe, but each sunset seemed to bring more distance and less meaning. When they reached Haran, they decided to camp for a few days. Terror had followed them this far, but the old man no longer had the strength to go on. Haran became the final resting place of Abraham's father. There, before the makeshift tomb of the man who had once led their household, Abraham felt the weight of loss. Sarai held him as if trying to hold on to what little remained. That night, alone, on top of a hill, Abraham looked up at the sky. The night's silence felt even more cruel without his father's presence. But deep down, something still burned in his chest. He knew the journey was just beginning. You've made it this far, and that alone fills us with joy. To keep receiving stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and share it with someone who needs to hear these messages. Without further delay, let's continue our journey. The altars of promise and fear. Genesis 12. The desert wind seemed to shift with every step they took. The journey was long, and the silence between Abraham and Sarai grew heavier with each passing day. As they left Haran, the caravan spread out across the vast plains. Abraham's heart burned with unanswered questions, but the only thing he knew for sure was that there was no turning back. He clung tightly to the promise whispered to him that night even when everything around him seemed to contradict every word. At every camp, Abraham distanced himself from the crowd. He climbed small hills, gathered stones, and built altars. He carried no idols like his father, no carved images of wood or gold. He simply stacked stones in silence, and at every altar a whispered prayer. "Who are you? Who took me from my father's house?" But heaven seemed to remain silent. Sarai watched from a distance. She saw her husband stacking stones, kneeling, and then returning without a word. In her heart, the anguish grew. The desert felt endless, and the promise more distant with every step. Food began to run low. The water skins grew lighter, and then came the news no one wanted to hear. There was a famine in the land. The shepherds started to murmur. The servants began to question. Lot, always eager for a better future, was the first to suggest, "There's provision in Egypt. Let's go down there." Abraham looked around. The dry ground, the weakened animals, shries, fearful eyes. Fear struck him hard, and for the first time he wavered in the promise. "We'll go to Egypt," he decided. Crossing the border wasn't difficult, but as they neared Egypt's walls, a new uneasiness filled Abraham's heart. He had heard the stories. He knew how the Egyptians looked at foreign women. Sarai, with her uncommon beauty, would not go unnoticed. That night in the tent, he approached her. He took her hands and whispered, "Please tell them you are my sister. That way they will spare my life because of you." Sarai pulled back, wounded. It sounded like betrayal, but she saw the fear in his eyes. Without the strength to argue, she simply nodded, swallowing the pain in her chest. Their days in Egypt began as a relief. Plenty of food, fresh water, safe shelter. But it didn't take long for the eyes of the palace to turn toward Sarai. She was taken to Pharaoh's presence, and Abraham, who stayed silent. He received livestock, servants, silver and gold. His possessions grew, but his soul withered with every day spent without Sarai by his side. Sarai, now among the king's women, tasted the bitter fruit of Abraham's decision. No amount of riches could replace love. No palace could substitute the freedom of walking beside the man who had once vowed to protect her. But heaven, which had seemed silent until then, moved. Plagues and diseases struck the palace. Pharaoh, distressed, summoned Abraham. "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" The king roared. Humiliated, Abraham bowed his head. There was no defense. Furious, Pharaoh returned Sarai to him and ordered them to leave. No amount of riches could erase what had happened. Sarai's eyes as she left the palace were filled with both pain and disappointment. Back in the desert, Abraham set up camp again. He built another altar. He fell to his knees before the stacked stones. There were no words, only silent tears. He knew he had failed. He knew he had let fear lead his steps. But there, among the dust and wind, he made a decision he would not give up. The promise was still alive. Even when everything seemed lost, the desert welcomed them back, and the journey continued between Lot and the invisible. Genesis 13. The journey back into the desert was quieter than anyone had imagined. The gold, the livestock, the servants they had gained in Egypt couldn't hide what had truly been lost. Sarai, though physically beside Abraham, carried in her eyes a distance that seemed impossible to bridge. Egypt had left marks that not even the desert wind could erase. The camp grew. What had once been a wandering family had become an impressive caravan. The herds multiplied. The servants spread across the plains, but along with expansion came conflict. Abraham's shepherds and Lot's shepherds began to fight over land and water. The pastures were no longer enough. Tension grew with each passing day. What had started as whispers turned into arguments, accusations, and threats. Tired of the strife, Abraham called Lot for a private conversation away from the servants. On top of a hill, they looked out over the land stretching as far as the eye could see. To the north, the lush plains of the Jordan. To the south, the dry and lonely mountains. "Let there be no quarrel between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and yours," Abraham said, his voice heavy, already knowing what was to come. "Choose where you want to go. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you choose the right, I will go to the left." Lot looked toward the Jordan. The valley looked like a garden, like the ancient stories of Eden, plenty of water, fertile land, prosperous cities. It was the obvious choice. It was the path of security. Without hesitation, Lot pointed to the valley. "I choose the Jordan," he declared. Abraham simply nodded. He watched his nephew head down with his tents, servants, and flocks toward the cities that would later be known as Sodom and Gomorrah. The old patriarch remained alone in the dry mountains with Sarai by his side and the wind as his only companion. The silence of Lot's departure echoed in Abraham's heart. What remained for him seemed poor, barren, lifeless. What was left now? But it was right there in what seemed the emptiest place that the voice returned. On that very hill where Lot had departed, heaven spoke once more. "Lift up your eyes, Abraham," the voice whispered. He obeyed. "Look to the north, the south, the east, and the west. All the land you see, I will give to you and to your descendants forever." The words seemed to contradict everything his human eyes could see. There were no rivers, no cities, no green fields. But the promise was not based on appearance. God continued, "I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth." If anyone could count the dust, then they could also count your offspring. With tears filling his eyes, Abraham fell to his knees, not because of what he saw, but because of what he believed. He built yet another altar. There, among the stones in silence, he renewed his commitment to the invisible. Sarai approached, touched his shoulder, and embraced him without saying a word. She knew that this man, though he had lost what seemed to be the better part, had gained something no one else could see. The mountain wind carried with it the certainty. Not everything that seems small to human eyes is small in the sight of God. The journey continued. The war Abraham never sought. Genesis 14. Time seemed to move differently for Abraham in the mountains of Canaan. Days passed under the same open sky with the same herds and the same servants. Sarai, though still carrying the scars of past wounds, had begun to smile again. It seemed that at last peace had settled over Abraham's camp, but peace never lasts forever. The news came like a whirlwind. 4 kings from the east had joined forces to destroy the cities of the Jordan Valley. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zor were at war. And in the midst of the chaos was Lot. Messengers brought reports of destruction. The cities had been plundered and their people taken as prisoners. Lot and his family were among the captives, marching in chains toward exile. Abraham listened in silence. His heart grew heavy. The nephew who had chosen the easy path was now a prisoner of war. The servants expected Abraham to do nothing. After all, Lot had made his choice. It was only fair that he face the consequences. But Abraham could not stand. He gathered his men, only 318 trained servants, shepherds who had never wielded swords in real battle, a small and insignificant force compared to the enemy armies. Sarai approached him before he left. "This is madness, my lord. You have no armies, no allies. You'll be killed." Abraham gently held her face. "I do not trust in the strength of men, but in the promise I have received. I cannot leave Lot in the hands of death." Under the cover of night, the small company set out. They followed the trail of the kings for days until they reached them in the land of Dan. Abraham divided his men into groups, spreading them around the enemy camp. The plan was bold: to attack at night when the guards were relaxed. The attack was swift and unexpected. The enemies, caught by surprise, retreated in confusion. Abraham and his men freed the captives and recovered all the stolen goods. The victory seemed impossible, but it unfolded before everyone's eyes. Lot, now free, fell at Abraham's feet. "Why did you come for me? I didn't deserve it." Abraham lifted him in silence. No words were needed as they returned with the captives and recovered goods. The king of Sodom came to meet Abraham. "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." The king offered, but Abraham raised his hand toward heaven and replied, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and I swear I will take nothing, not a thread or a sandal strap, so that you cannot say, 'I made Abraham rich.'" Abraham knew that true reward did not lie in earthly riches or human glory. True strength came from the promise that had called him out of upon returning to the camp. He built another altar. Sarai was waiting for him, tears of relief filling her eyes. The war he never sought was over, but the journey of the promise was far from finished. The priest who brought heaven to earth. Genesis 14. The camp was still celebrating the unexpected victory over the kings of the east. Word spread like wildfire that Abraham, with only 318 men, had defeated armies no city dared to face. His name spread among tribes and caravans. Too many. Abraham had become a prince among the peoples, a warrior feared and respected. But Abraham knew the victory had not come from his hands. While the men settled the tents and gathered the recovered livestock, Abraham walked alone across the plains. The weight of responsibility still burned in his heart. He had won, but something deep inside told him there was a greater path ahead, something his eyes could not yet see. Then he saw a figure approaching in the distance. Unlike the kings he had faced, this man came without armies, without shouts, without threats. He came in peace. His name was Melchizedek. Dressed in simple robes, the man carried bread and wine in his hands. He did not look like a king. He wore no crown, bore no insignia, yet in his eyes was something Abraham had never seen before, a silent authority, as if all of heaven walked with him. Melchizedek stopped before Abraham and, without anyone announcing him, declared loudly, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands." The words pierced Abraham's heart like an arrow. No king, no priest, no man had ever spoken of the Most High God with such clarity. He mentioned no stone gods, no golden idols. He spoke of the creator of heaven and earth, the same one who had called Abraham that night in without hesitation. Abraham bowed and gave Melchizedek a tenth of all he possessed, not as payment, but as a recognition that everything came from the invisible hands of the God who now had a name. I watched the scene from a distance in silence. She didn't fully understand, but she knew something sacred was happening before her eyes. Melchizedek asked for nothing more. He demanded no territory, no alliances. He simply blessed Abraham and departed as if he had come only to remind him that there was a greater kingdom, a throne above all thrones, a God who did not need to be seen to be real. When the man disappeared over the horizon, Abraham remained on his knees, his face to the ground. At last he understood his journey was not about lands, kingdoms, or human victories. It was about an eternal calling, about an invisible king who guided his every step. That night, Abraham built a new altar, not to ask for anything, but simply to give thanks. He knew the road ahead would still be long, but now he walked with eyes open to something far greater than he had ever imagined. The promise was only beginning to reveal its true greatness. The God who walks among the stars, Genesis 15. The nights had grown silent once again in the plains of Canaan. The glow of victory over the kings of the east had already faded, and routine once more weighed heavily on Abraham's shoulders. The promises remained alive in his memory, but reality seemed to mock every word heaven had whispered to him. He was old. Sarai, still by his side, carried the same pain in her eyes. The years had piled on her like dust in the desert. The womb that had once dreamed of bringing forth life remained silent, empty. Time felt like a merciless enemy, eating away at their hopes, stealing their smiles. One night, unable to sleep, Abraham left the tent and walked toward the hills. The wind felt colder than usual. He fell to his knees, and for the first time in a long while, dared to ask, "Lord God, what will you give me since I remain childless? The heir of all I have will be Elisa of Damascus, my servant." The silence felt crushing, but then the voice returned. "This man will not be your heir, Abraham." The old patriarch lifted his face, searching in the darkness for some kind of sign. "Then who, Lord? How can this be, since I have no child?" Like a father guiding a trembling child, God led him out of the darkness of the tent. The sky stretched wide and clear above him, thousands of stars shining like watchful eyes. "Look to the sky, Abraham," the voice whispered. "Count the stars if you can. So shall your descendants be." The old man looked up. He tried to count them, but soon got lost in the vastness. His chest began to burn. Tears filled his tired eyes. For the first time, he no longer saw his limitations. For the first time, he no longer saw Sarai's aging body. For the first time, he believed. In that moment, something changed. Faith born in the midst of darkness was counted as righteousness before God. Heaven leaned down to earth. The invisible became present. God then revealed something even deeper. He commanded Abraham to prepare a sacrifice, a heifer, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. Abraham obeyed, cutting each animal in half, according to the covenant custom. Day turned to night once again, and Abraham fell into a deep sleep. A thick darkness surrounded him, and he had a terrifying vision. Smoke, fire, suffering. He heard the promise that his descendants would be foreigners in a strange land, enslaved, but later delivered with great possessions. When he awoke, he saw a smoking firepot and a blazing torch passing between the pieces of the animals. God, the invisible one, was sealing the covenant, not like men do with empty words, but with fire and real presence. "To your descendants I give this land," the voice declared, "from Egypt to the Euphrates." Abraham fell to the ground in tears. The one who walks among the stars had come down to seal the promise with him. That night, he asked for no explanations. He demanded no signs. He simply believed. And as the wind rustled the tents of the camp, The sky in silence smiled, the weight that led to a mistake. Genesis 16. The days following the sealed covenant were filled with hope, renewed. Abraham gazed at the sky every night, imagining the children to come. Sarai, though she didn't fully understand what her husband had experienced, tried to share in his faith. But time is always a cruel test. Seasons passed. The tents remained empty of children's laughter. Each passing moon brought Sarai the same bitter answer. Her womb remained closed. The light in Abraham's eyes began to dim, and the promise started to sound more like a distant dream carried away by the desert wind. One night, lying beside her husband in the heavy silence, Sarai turned to him. "The Lord has kept me from having children," she murmured, her voice trembling. Perhaps we should take action." Abraham looked at her in silence, trying to understand what she meant. Sarai took a deep breath, fighting back the weight of her own words. "Take my servant Agar the Egyptian. Perhaps through her we can build a family." Abraham felt his heart grow heavy. He knew the promise had come from the mouth of the Most High, but time had worn down his certainty. Sarai's words, though painful, seemed to make sense. If heaven remained silent, perhaps it was time to act by their own means. That very night, Hagar was called to the tent. The young woman, frightened and silent, obeyed without question. It was not her choice, she was a servant. She simply did what she was told. Months passed and Hagar's belly began to grow. What seemed like a solution actually cast a shadow over Abraham's household. Sarai, who had suggested it, could no longer bear the sight of her servant's growing belly. With every glance from Hagar, Sarai felt as though she was being reminded of her own barrenness. Jealousy poisoned her soul like venom. Hagar, on the other hand, could no longer endure Sarai's contempt. Among the women of the household, she now carried something Sarai had never been able to produce. The servant began to despise the woman who had once owned her as property. The arguments began. The silence between Abraham and Sarai grew heavier than ever. Sarai, wounded, confronted her husband. "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to you and now she despises me." Abraham, exhausted and powerless, replied, "She is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think is best." Driven by a pain she couldn't explain, Sarai began to mistreat Hagar. The atmosphere became unbearable. Desperate, Hagar fled into the desert. But heaven, though many believed it silent, had never stopped watching. In the desert, near a spring of water, the angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" the angel asked. Through tears she replied, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel then gave her a promise that would change her story. "Return to your mistress and submit to her. I will greatly multiply your descendants. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you shall name him Ishmael because the Lord has heard your misery." Hagar returned. In her eyes, a new light. She knew she had not been forgotten. The boy was born, and Abraham named him Ishmael. But neither Sarai nor Abraham nor even Hagar could imagine the consequences of that decision. A silence fell once again over Abraham's household, but this time it was a different silence, not one of hope, but of unresolved conflict, and the true promise still seemed far away. The mark that sealed the flesh and the soul. Genesis 17. The years continued to pass, as if heaven had forgotten the promise. Ishmael grew strong, running between the tents and calling Abraham father. The old patriarch looked at the boy with affection, trying to convince his own heart that Ishmael was in fact the promised heir. Sarai, however, could never fully accept the child who was not hers. The silence between her and Abraham stood like an unbreakable wall surrounded by servants, flocks, and wealth. Abraham carried an uneasiness inside him. Something told him there was still something missing. God's words felt distant, like a lost echo in time. The boy who ran through the tents did not fully satisfy the promise. With every sunset, Abraham found himself looking up at the sky, searching for an answer that never seemed to come. But then God came again. Abraham was 99 years old, when on an ordinary morning the invisible one he had long sought made himself heard more clearly than ever. "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless." The old man fell face down. His body trembled. Fear and reverence mingled like fire and wind. God continued, "I will establish my covenant with you and will greatly multiply your descendants." Before Abraham could respond, God changed everything. "Your name will no longer be Abram, but Abraham, for I have made you the father of many nations." The sound of his new name seemed to break the invisible chains that had bound him to the past. But the covenant did not stop there. "This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised." Abraham swallowed hard. The sign of the promise would not be something visible to others, but something intimate, painful, cut into the flesh of every man in his household. A constant reminder that the promise required blood, surrender, and obedience. "This will be the sign of the covenant between me and you," the Lord concluded. Abraham obeyed. He gathered all the men in his camp, servants, sons, and foreigners, and that very afternoon, with his own hands he began the ritual. Each man was marked, each body bore the pain, and with every cut, the covenant was sealed. Sarai watched from a distance. The blood spilled seemed to cry out in the silence of the afternoon. But to her surprise, God also called her by name. Your wife will no longer be called Sarai, but Sarah, for I will bless her and give you a son by her. Abraham fell face down again and laughed, not in mockery, but in disbelief mingled with hope. He was old Sarah too. It was impossible. And yet the God who walks among the stars declared, I will bless her and she will become the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Abraham tried to plead for Ishmael, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. But God was clear. Your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. Yet God did not reject Ishmael. He promised that Ishmael too would become a great nation. But the true promise would come through Sarah, through Isaac. That night the entire camp lay under the weight of both pain and promise. Abraham, now marked in both flesh and soul, knew there was no turning back. The mark was cut into his body. The new name echoed in his mind. The promise seemed impossible, but it was more alive than ever. The laughter of the impossible. Genesis 18. The camp was preparing for yet another day under the relentless sun of Canaan. Abraham, now bearing his new name and the mark of the covenant on his body, kept his eyes on the horizon every morning. With every sunrise, he wondered if this would be the day the impossible would become real. Sarah, meanwhile, buried herself in her daily tasks, avoiding the weight of the promise that pressed so heavily on her heart. That day's heat seemed even more intense than usual. Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent under the shade of the trees, trying to escape the heat, when he saw 3 men approaching. They were not like ordinary travelers. There was something about their presence that made the old man rise immediately, bow low to the ground, and run to meet them. My lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass by without stopping at my home, Abraham pleaded, recognizing that there was something divine about these visitors. He asked for water, bread, and rest for the traveler's feet. In haste he ran to Sarah and asked her to prepare the finest bread. He selected the best calf and had it roasted. He served them with milk and butter, offering all he had as if he was serving heaven itself. While they ate, one of the men looked directly at Abraham and asked, Where is Sarah, your wife? Abraham replied, his heart pounding, She is in the tent. Then came the promise. I will surely return to you this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Inside the tent, Sarah heard every word. When she heard it, she couldn't hold back a quiet laugh. It was a bitter laugh, the instinctive reaction of someone who had cried too long for something that now felt impossible. After I am worn out and my lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? She murmured to herself with a mix of pain and irony. But the visitor's voice cut through the fabric of the tent and reached her heart. Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, Will I really have a child now that I'm old? Silence fell like a heavy stone. Sarah's heart raced. She hadn't realized she had been heard. Is anything too hard for the Lord? The man added. Terrified, Sarah tried to deny it. I did not laugh, she said, but the response came firm like an arrow striking the truth deep within her soul. Yes, you did laugh. Sarah felt the ground slip from under her feet. This stranger had seen what even she could not admit aloud. The fear, the doubt, the weariness of waiting for something that seemed it would never come. Her laugh had been exposed before heaven music itself. Today, visitors stood and looked toward distant Sodom. Abraham walked with them, and the most remarkable thing was that, even after Sarah's revealed doubt, the Lord had not withdrawn the promise. On the contrary, he had reaffirmed that he would return and that Sarah would be a mother. Alone, facing the horizon, Abraham felt a lump in his throat. It was no longer a matter of who deserved it. It wasn't about who was worthy or strong enough. It was about the faithfulness of a God who saw the human heart with all its flaws and still chose to fulfill his promises. The old man looked up at the sky once more. He knew the impossible was coming, and even if no one else could believe it yet, heaven had already decided. Every story revealed here is just a small part of something much greater. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone special. Together, let's keep this mission alive. Now, let's return to where the narrative left off. The intercessor between condemned cities. Genesis 18. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains when the 3 visitors rose to leave. Abraham walked with them in silence, still trying to process all that had just happened. The promise about Sarah still burned in his heart like a flame lit by the very hand of God. But as he looked toward the valley of the Jordan, the faces of the visitors grew solemn. Sodom and Gomorrah, cities that seemed so prosperous in human eyes, were now the target of divine judgment. The sin of those cities had risen to heaven like an unbearable cry, and the Lord had decided to come down to see it for himself. It was as if heaven itself was about to pass sentence. Abraham walked beside them. Uneasy, he knew who lived there. Lot and his family were in Sodom. The weight of the news crushed the old patriarch's heart. He could not remain silent. Taking courage, he drew closer to the Lord. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous who are in it? Abraham's voice trembled. He knew he was speaking to the Creator, to the Holy One. Yet he dared to plead. The Lord replied with a calm that pierced the soul. If I find 50 righteous in Sodom, I will spare the whole city for their sake." Abraham took a deep breath, but couldn't stop there. "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there," the Lord answered. Abraham looked down, weighed down by his own boldness, but continued, "What if only 40 are found there? For the sake of 40 I will not do it." The dialogue continued, like a dance between courage and reverence. 30, then 20. Each time Abraham dared to intercede, the Lord showed mercy. Finally, with his heart in his hands, Abraham asked one last time, "Please, Lord, do not be angry with me if I speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" The Lord replied, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." Then the Lord departed, and Abraham returned to his tent. The old patriarch stood there looking out over the darkening horizon. He knew there were no guarantees. He knew Lot was in danger. But for the first time clearly he also knew that the God who walks among the stars is a God who listens. Abraham had discovered something few dared to believe. The Almighty is not only a distant judge, but one who is willing to hear the cries of a broken man. That night, the patriarch lay down with his heart torn between hope and fear, and in the silence that comes before judgment, he knew heaven was still listening. The woman who turned to salt. Genesis 19. The silence of the night seemed to hide a dark warning. Abraham rose early that morning, and from the hill where he had pitched his tents, looked toward the valley of the Jordan. In the distance, the city still slept, unaware of the judgment that was drawing near. 2 of the 3 visitors who had passed by his tent had arrived in Sodom the evening before. Lot was sitting at the city gate when he saw them. Recognizing that something greater accompanied them, he hurried to welcome them into his home, but the streets of the city soon filled with wicked men. They surrounded Lot's house and demanded that he hand over the strangers. In a desperate act, Lot tried to protect his guests, even to the point of offering his own daughters to satisfy the fury of the mob. But the visitors, who were more than mere travelers, reached out, pulled Lot back inside, and struck the attackers with blindness. Then the sentence was declared, "Get everyone out of here because we are going to destroy this place." Lot hesitated, caught between the urgency of the warning and his attachment to the city he had chosen to live in. He delayed. The angels grabbed his hands along with those of his wife and 2 daughters and led them out of the city. "Flee for your lives. Do not look back and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away." The night was marked by the silent flight of the small family. It was as if heaven itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment justice would be unleashed. Then at daybreak, fire and sulfur rained down from heaven like a burning storm. The cities were engulfed in flames. The buildings, the fields, the gardens, all were destroyed. The entire valley was consumed by smoke and ruin. Along the path of escape, Lot's wife faltered. She turned back, disobeying the command that had saved them from death. Her eyes sought one last time the city she had left behind. The key price was immediate. Before the eyes of her daughters and her husband, she was turned into a pillar of salt. Lot fell to the ground weeping. His daughters pulled him by the hand, urging him to continue, but his heart was already shattered. From a distance on the hilltop, Abraham watched it all in silence. The sky before him seemed wounded. The valley that had once shone like Eden now smoldered like a field of death. The promised destruction had come to pass, and the intercession, however sincere, had not found 10 righteous. The patriarch stood there for hours saying nothing. He knew that Lot had been spared by mercy, but the cost had been far too great. In Abraham's memory, the image of the woman who turned to salt would remain forever, a bitter reminder that sometimes the human heart refuses to let go of what God has already declared lost. The old man turned, went back to his tent, and knelt once again before the altar. Deep down he knew the journey was not yet over. The laughter that finally came. Genesis 21. Abraham's camp now stretched across a vast plain. Tents, flocks, servants, and caravans moved back and forth under the watchful eye of the old patriarch. Yet, despite all this outward greatness, deep inside, Abraham knew that the greatest of all his treasures had still not arrived. Sarah walked slowly among the tents, her silver hair and face marked by time. She had learned to hide her sadness behind her duties, to silence her empty womb with the routines of the day. Ishmael, the son of Hagar, grew strong, running freely among the servants, calling Abraham father, stirring in Sarah a mix of love and pain she no longer tried to hide. But heaven had not forgotten. One morning, before the camp had fully awakened, Sarah awoke with a strange feeling. The pains began softly like a whisper, but soon turned into waves that spread through her body with growing intensity. The servants rushed to her side. When Abraham heard the cries, he ran from the tent in desperation, his hands trembling, his eyes filled with tears. The impossible was happening. Sarah was taken into the largest tent. The labor was long, and the entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Abraham remained on his knees outside, his face pressed to the ground, hands lifted to heaven, silently repeating the promise he had heard so many years ago. and then a baby's cry pierced the morning silence. The servants rushed out, smiling as if carrying news capable of shaking the world. Abraham stood up, staggering, his heart racing wildly. When he entered the tent, he saw Sarah holding a tiny boy in her arms. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. "He's here, my lord," Sarah whispered, between sobs and laughter. Abraham approached slowly, as if afraid to wake from a dream. He touched his wife's face, then his trembling hands reached for the tiny body of the child. The baby stirred, opened his eyes for the first time, and Abraham felt the weight of all those years of waiting melt away. "His name will be Isaac," Abraham declared, his voice breaking. Sarah laughed, not the bitter laugh of disbelief, but the pure laugh of someone who had just seen the impossible become real. "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children?" she whispered through her laughter. "But the Lord has done this for me." The whole camp was filled with joy. Abraham lifted the child to the heavens like a living offering. The God who walks among the stars had fulfilled his word. The old patriarch, now holding his son in his arms, looked toward the horizon. The desert seemed different, as if every grain of sand was bearing witness to the miracle. The laughter that had once seemed impossible had finally arrived. The son who had to leave. Genesis 21. Time seemed to move faster after Isaac was born. The boy grew under Sarah's watchful eye, and she now walked with her head held high, as if she finally felt honored before everyone. Isaac's laughter echoed among the tents, mingling with the voices of the servants and the bleating of the flocks. Abraham saw in him the fulfillment of the promise that for so long had seemed so distant. But not every smile is complete when the past still walks among the tents. Ishmael, the son of Hagar, also grew strong. Fearless, he ran across the same plains, playing among the servants, as if that place belonged to him as well. But Sarah saw every step of the boy as a threat. Day by day, the presence of Hagar and Ishmael became more unbearable in her eyes. On the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham prepared a great feast. The entire camp celebrated. Laughter, music, and joy filled the air. But in the midst of the celebration, Sarah saw something that made her blood boil. Ishmael, now almost a young man, was playing with Isaac. Perhaps teasing, perhaps just acting as brothers do. But for Sarah, it was the last straw. Later, when the fires had burned low and the laughter had quieted, she approached Abraham with a hardened look. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. "That woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Her words hit Abraham like a stone. He walked away, trying to process what he had just heard. His heart shattered. Ishmael was his son. The boy had grown in his arms, had called him father, had followed him through the desert. How could he send him away? Abraham withdrew in silence. The weight of the decision crushed him. But that night, God spoke again. "Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, for it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. But I will also make the son of the slave into a great nation because he is your seed." The old patriarch felt the tears fall. He knew what he had to do, but that didn't make the pain any less. Early the next morning, Abraham got up before dawn. He prepared a skin of water and some bread. Hagar stood at the entrance of the tent, already aware of what was coming. She held Ishmael's hand, her eyes red from weeping. Abraham approached slowly, unable to look at them for long. He handed the water and bread to Hagar. He tried to speak, but no word seemed enough. Finally, he gently touched Ishmael's face, trying to memorize every feature of the son he was about to lose. Without saying anything more, Abraham stepped back as Hagar and Ishmael walked off toward the desert of Beer. From a distance, Sarah watched in silence, believing that now everything would finally be at peace. But Abraham knew that peace never comes without pain. Standing there watching the figures of Hagar and Ishmael disappear on the horizon, the old patriarch felt his chest tighten like never before. He had obeyed, but his heart had been left broken on the path. The desert wind blew harder that day, as if heaven itself was mourning in silence. And the promise continued, even through farewells. No one wanted to live. The God who provides at the last moment, Genesis 22, the years following Ishmael's departure, seemed to have finally brought some peace to old Abraham. Isaac was growing strong, joyful, and curious. The boy was everything Sarah had ever dreamed of, and more than Abraham had ever imagined he would live to see. In every laugh of his son, the patriarch saw the fulfillment of the impossible. It was as if heaven smiled every time Isaac ran through the fields, but the promise had never been just about joy. One night, while Abraham was tending the campfires, heaven once again broke the silence. Abraham called the voice. The old man recognized it immediately. "Here I am, Lord." What came next made the blood freeze in his veins. "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a sacrifice on one of the mountains I will show you." The ground seemed to vanish beneath his feet. Abraham felt his legs give way, but there was no space for argument. The voice that had guided him from was now leading him down a path no man would ever dare to walk by his own will. He said nothing to Sarah. The next morning he prepared the wood, called to servants, and took Isaac by the hand. They set out in silence. The journey to Moriah took 3 days. 3 days where every step seemed to weigh 1,000 times heavier. Isaac, innocent, walked beside his father, glancing curiously at Abraham's silence. At one point, the boy broke the silence. "Father, we have the wood and the fire, but where is the lamb for the offering?" The old man swallowed hard, holding back his tears. "God will provide the lamb, my son." On the third day, Abraham saw the mountain in the distance. He asked the servants to stay behind and continued alone with Isaac. They climbed together, the boy carrying the wood on his shoulders like a lamb being led to the altar. At the top, Abraham built the altar with trembling hands. He arranged the wood just as the ritual required. In silence, he called Isaac and bound him on the altar. The boy's eyes filled with confusion and fear. Abraham raised the knife. Heaven seemed to hold its breath. And then the voice called again, "Abraham, Abraham." The old man stopped midair, the blade suspended. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." The tears fell like rain. Abraham lowered the knife, untied Isaac, and embraced him tightly. The boy wept in his arms. Then Abraham heard a sound behind him. He turned and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. The old patriarch fell to his knees and worshipped. He took the ram and offered it as a sacrifice exactly as the Lord had promised. In that place, Abraham named the altar, "Jajir, the Lord will provide." As they descended the mountain, Abraham knew he would never be the same. He had learned that the promise, the son, the future, all belonged to the Lord. And at the last moment, when all seemed lost, God had proved that he never arrives late. The old patriarch looked at Isaac walking ahead of him and smiled in silence. The God who had provided on the mountain was still writing his story. The loss no father wants to face. Genesis 23. The days after the sacrifice on Mount Moriah were marked by silence. Abraham walked differently. His gaze carried a depth that few could understand. Isaac grew in stature and favor, but Sarah began to bend under the weight of time. The joy that had once brightened the days after Isaac's birth now seemed like a distant memory. Sarah, now aged, walked more slowly. The steps that had once crossed deserts and faced kings now faltered. Yet even in her weakness, she still looked at Abraham with that same spark of companionship, as if to say, "I went all the way with you." Years passed, until on a cold morning in the plains of Kiriath Arba, also known as Hebron, Sarah's breath came to an end. Abraham felt the world collapse beneath his feet. The woman who had laughed and wept with him, who had left by his side, who had stood with him through victories and losses, was gone. He knelt beside the tent. He touched her face one last time, as if trying to imprint every detail in his memory. The tears that fell were not only of pain, but also of gratitude. Sarah had been the companion of his entire journey. The promise had passed through her. The camp fell silent in mourning. Servants, shepherds, even the foreigners among them stopped their work. All recognized who Sarah had been, the mother of the promise, the matriarch of Abraham's household. But even in his grief, the old patriarch knew he had to honor the woman who had walked beside him. Abraham stood and sought out the sons of Het, the inhabitants of the land. He approached them humbly, though he was regarded as a prince among the people. "I am a foreigner and a stranger among you," he said. "Sell me a burial site among you so that I can bury my wife and lay her to rest out of my sight." The sons of Het honored him and offered any tomb he wished, but Abraham already knew which place he would choose. The cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron near Mount. Before the assembly, Abraham bowed in respect and insisted on buying the land, refusing to accept it as a gift. "Listen to me," Abraham said. "I will pay the full price for the field." The agreement was made. 400 shekels of silver were weighed out, and the land became Abraham's property. Abraham returned to the camp and with his servants prepared Sarah's body. They carried her to the cave and in silence laid her to rest in the land that now belonged to them. Abraham stood at the entrance of the cave, his heart in pieces. The desert seemed larger, emptier. For the first time since he had heard God's voice he felt truly alone. He knew the promise still stood. He knew Isaac carried the future, but none of that lessened the pain of the farewell. The woman who had been his partner in the journey now rested in the dust of the earth. As the old patriarch walked away from the cave, he knew some losses no man can escape. But even in death, the promise remained alive. The bridegroom who came from the desert. Genesis 24. Music. The days Abraham spent wandering alone among the fields of Machpelah, seated in the shadow of the stones that held Sarah's body, seemed endless. The old patriarch carried in his heart the weight of loneliness, but also the responsibility of ensuring that the promise would not stop with his generation. Isaac, now a young man, walked with steps that reminded Abraham more and more of himself. The silence between them said what words could not. It was time for the son to walk his own path. Time for the promise to extend beyond him. But one thing Abraham knew for certain. Isaac's wife could not come from Canaan. The God who had called him to a foreign land did not want his heir to be joined to the peoples who lived there. The promise needed to be preserved. So Abraham called his most trusted servant, Eliezer of Damascus, a man who had walked beside him throughout the journey. "Swear to me by the Lord," the God of heaven and earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites. Go to my family and take a wife for Isaac from there." Abraham said firmly. Eliezer hesitated. "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Should I then take your son back to the land of your family?" But Abraham was clear. "Make sure you do not take my son back there. The Lord will send his angel before you, and you will take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman refuses to come, you will be released from this oath." Eliezer set out with 10 camels loaded with gifts, crossing the desert toward Mesopotamia. Throughout the journey, the servant prayed in silence, fearing he might fail in the most important task of his life. When he reached the city of Nar, he made the camels kneel by the well at evening time. When the young women came out to draw water, with a heavy heart, he prayed, "Lord, God of my master Abraham, give me success today. Here I am by the well. May it be that the young woman to whom I say, 'Please let me drink a little water from your jar,' and who responds, 'Drink, and I will water your camels also,' may she be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac." Before he had even finished praying, a young woman appeared, Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel from the house of Nar, Abraham's brother. She carried a jar on her shoulder and walked with grace. Eliezer ran to meet her and asked for a little water. To his amazement, she answered exactly as he had prayed, "Drink, my lord, and I will also draw water for your camels." Stunned, Eliezer remained silent, watching as she drew water for all the animals. When she finished, he bowed down to the ground and worshipped the Lord. The God of Abraham had answered before he could ask again. Rebekah brought him to her family's house, and Eliezer told them everything that had happened. Bethuel and her brother Laban recognized God's hand in it and agreed to let her go. The next day, Rebekah bravely accepted to go with the stranger, leaving everything behind to become the wife of a man she had never seen. She mounted the camels and set out toward the unknown, carrying in her heart both hope and fear for what lay ahead. From a distance, while meditating in the field, Isaac saw the caravan approaching. When Rebekah dismounted and asked who the man coming toward them was, Eliezer replied, "He is my master." Rebekah covered her face with her veil, and there, in the middle of the desert, the two met for the first time. Isaac took Rebekah as his wife, and at last he found comfort after the loss of his mother. The promise was still alive, the blessing that came back to life. Genesis 24. The days following the return of the caravan brought Abraham a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of absence nor the emptiness of loss. It was a silence filled with meaning, as if heaven had smiled upon him once again. Rebekah, now Isaac's wife, moved among the tents with ease, as if she had always belonged there. She carried with her the courage of one who had left everything behind to obey an invisible calling. Every gesture reminded Abraham of the young Sarah who had once followed him across these same lands. Abraham watched them from a distance without interfering. Isaac and Rebekah spoke little in public, but in their exchanged glances, one could see the seed of something time would soon reveal. The old patriarch knew the promise had not died with him, but was quietly growing in the generation now walking before his eyes. The nights once again became times of vigil for Abraham. He would rise early and walk through the fields, stepping on the stones where years before he had built altars. Every stone, every hill, every path, all told a story no one knew as well as he did. On one of these early mornings, while looking up at the stars that had so often been his comfort, Abraham knelt and stretched his arms toward heaven. "Lord, you have been faithful, even when I doubted, even when I feared, even when I failed." Tears streamed down his aged face. He no longer asked for anything. He simply gave thanks. As the camp began to stir, Isaac approached. The son stood silently beside his father for a moment, as if to honor the moment. Then he sat down beside him, also looking up at the sky. Abraham turned to Isaac, smiled and placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "Take care of her," he said, referring to Rebekah. "She is an answer heaven has sent to you." Isaac nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. There was little more to say. Both knew what that moment meant. Abraham stood up slowly, his body tired, but his soul at peace. He looked one last time at the camp, now alive with the laughter of new servants, the movement of flocks, and the light of a future unfolding before him. He knew the end of his journey was near. His body no longer responded as before, and the nights weighed heavier on him with each passing day. But as he watched Isaac and Rebekah walking hand in hand among the tents, he understood something greater than any personal promise. The blessing had not died with Sarah. It had not ended with Ishmael, nor would it stop with Isaac. The blessing had come back to life. Your support is what drives us to bring each chapter of this story to you. Subscribe, like, and share so more people can be reached by these hidden truths. Ready? Then let's continue the story. The sons who still divide the world. Genesis 25. Time passed like a breath over Abraham's already bowed head. Now the old patriarch moved slowly among the tents, every step reminding him of the long journey he had made since his eyes, though tired, still carried the light of a man who had seen the invisible and heard what no one else dared to believe. The peace that Isaac and Rebekah brought to the camp, however, could not erase the memory of the son who had once left Ishmael, the boy who had grown up in his arms. The young man who had gone away with his mother to the desert of Beersheba still lived in the old father's heart. News brought by passing caravans spoke of Ishmael as a strong man, leader of a great tribe, father of 12 princes. He had settled east of Egypt in the lands near Shur, just as the Lord had promised. Meanwhile, Isaac was beginning to walk his own path, the heir of the promise God had made to his father. 2 sons, 2 stories, 2 nations growing like rivers flowing in opposite directions, sitting under the shade of a tree. Abraham meditated in silence. He watched the servants preparing the tents, the flocks grazing in the fields, and felt the weight of what he would leave behind. His legacy was not just a story of faith and obedience, it was also a story of divisions he had never been able to prevent. The old man knew that Isaac and Ishmael, though separated by geography and destiny, shared the same blood. 2 sons, 2 peoples, 2 heritages that would continue to cross paths and clash through generations to come. He remembered Ishmael's face the day he had sent him away, the pain that had consumed him for days. He also remembered the moment when he had raised the knife over Isaac, ready to lose everything in obedience. Now, as he looked toward the horizon, he saw that the promise lived on in both of them, in ways he could no longer control. The sons still divided the world, but in Abraham's heart, they were both sons of the same story. He stood with difficulty, called Isaac, and asked him to sit by his side. He told him everything he knew about his brother, about the God who had heard him in the desert, about the nations that would come from him. Abraham knew that one day the paths of Ishmael and Isaac would cross again, and when that happened, he hoped their children and grandchildren would remember that before they were rivals. They were brothers. The old patriarch closed his eyes for a moment and in his heart whispered one final prayer. May the Lord of the promise guide the sons of my blood, even when they forget each other. Abraham knew that what had started with him was now spreading throughout the world and nothing would ever be the same again. His time of departure was drawing near, but the story was still being written. The final years of God's friend, Genesis 25, the years following Isaac and Rebekah's union, brought a new season of peace to the camp. Abraham, now advanced in age, walked slowly, but his spirit seemed lighter than ever before. The old man who had once left, fearing the unknown, now wandered the same lands with the eyes of one who had seen the impossible become reality. But heaven still had a few more surprises in store for the patriarch. After years of mourning for Sarah, Abraham found a new companion in Keturah. No one in the camp dared to question it. The woman of humble origin brought the old man an unexpected breath of youth, and to everyone's astonishment, Keturah gave him more children. Zeman, Jekshan, Medan, Midian, Isbah, and Shua were born from a woman Abraham had never imagined would stand by his side. Each child seemed to awaken in him a joy long forgotten. The camp once again echoed with the sound of small footsteps and children's laughter. The servants whispered. Some said the old man was trying to relive what he had lost with Ishmael. Others believed he was simply clinging to life as if afraid of the end. But Abraham knew that the God who had called him from the beginning was the same one who still surprised his old age with new life. Even so, Abraham was fully aware of the promise. He knew that although he loved each of his children, it was Isaac who carried the covenant. As the years went by, Abraham began to put his house in order. He called each of his sons, gave them gifts, and sent them to the lands of the east, away from Isaac, so that the promise would not be divided among them. The old patriarch wandered among the tents in silence, watching Isaac and Rebekah lead the camp. Seeing them lead with wisdom and reverence for the Most High God brought him a comfort that even the many years of wandering had not given. The nights grew long again. Abraham would lie under the stars, remembering every promise, every altar, every sacrifice. He thought of Sarai, of Hagar, of Ishmael, of Isaac, of Melchizedek, of the voices that had called to him in the dark, and of the tears he had shed on Mount Moriah. The old man smiled. Though his body was weak, his spirit was at peace. He knew his journey was nearly over, but the story that had begun with him, that story would never end. Abraham closed his eyes, listening to the sound of the wind, as if hearing one last time the voice of the friend who had walked with him all his life, the one who had called him and the one who had walked with him under the stars, the one who had never abandoned him, even in his failures, was still there. And the old patriarch knew with all certainty in his heart the friend was waiting for him on the other side. The death of the father of promises. Genesis 25. Time, which had once been Abraham's greatest enemy, now walked beside him like an old companion. His steps no longer carried the haste of youth, and the patriarch's bent body seemed to carry not only the weight of age, but also the weight of a story the world would never forget. The mornings were slower now, and the nights longer. Abraham spent hours sitting at the entrance of his tent, watching Isaac and Rebekah lead all that he had once built. The servant still honored him like a king, but he knew his time was drawing near. He had already seen the promise come to life. He had already held the impossible in his arms. He had already experienced the faithfulness of the God who had called him. And now, as the wind swept through the plains of Mumba, he felt the final page of his story was about to turn. It was on a quiet morning that the servants noticed the old man had not come out of his tent. Isaac entered and found his father lying there, his gaze fixed on something beyond the leather and curtains. Abraham's lips moved in prayer, whispering words only heaven could understand. Isaac approached, held his father's hand, and knelt beside him. The old man gently squeezed his son's fingers as if saying goodbye without needing many words. "The God of the promise. He is faithful," Abraham murmured with a frail voice. Those were his final words. The entire camp fell silent. The servants wept. Rebecca covered her face in grief. But what no one expected happened next. There, coming from the horizon, a man approached, riding a camel. It was Ishmael. Years of distance, silence, and separate paths seemed to vanish with the wind in that moment. Isaac ran to meet his brother, his eyes filled with pain and surprise. They embraced as if they had never been apart. Together, the two sons of Abraham prepared their father's body. They carried him to the cave of Machpelah, where Sarah already rested. Side by side, the two brothers lowered the body of the man who had united them in the same blood and the same promise. The tomb was sealed in silence. There were no speeches, no grand ceremonies, just two brothers in mourning, and heaven as a silent witness. Abraham was gone. But what had begun with him was only beginning to reach the generations to come. The father of promises now rested, but the promise lived on, the legacy that never died. Time so relentless with men seemed powerless to erase Abraham's name. Decades had passed since the old patriarch had been laid to rest in Machpelah, but his memory had not been left behind, buried with his body. On the contrary, Abraham's name began to grow, not only among the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, but in lands he had never dreamed of reaching. The tents that had once stood on the plains of Canaan were gone. The stone altars he had built had vanished with the wind and time. The servants who had called him master, the shepherds who had tended his flocks, all had returned to dust, yet his name continued to echo like a flame that time could not extinguish. Generations carried the memory of the man who dared to listen to an invisible voice. Jews, Arabs, and Christians, each in their own way, began to call him father. The God he had followed in silence through the deserts became known as the God of Abraham. The promise, which had once seemed small, confined to one man and his family, grew to become the hope of entire nations. In the mouths of the prophets, Abraham's name was repeated as a symbol of faith that goes beyond what the eyes can see. In ancient songs, he was remembered as the man who believed against all odds. And in the scrolls preserved by the wise, he came to be called the friend of God. In the deserts of Arabia, his son Ishmael became the father of countless nations. In the mountains of Canaan, Isaac became the father of Jacob, from whom the 12 tribes would rise to form a nation. Centuries later, other peoples, other languages, other continents, all would recognize in Abraham a landmark between heaven and earth. Kingdoms rose and fell, empires were built and destroyed. But Abraham's name crossed walls, deserts, and generations, not as the name of a king or warrior, but as the name of a man who dared to believe. Every time heaven is invoked as the God of Abraham, the echo of his journey is remembered. He built no cities, he founded no dynasties of stone thrones, he left no palaces or monuments, but he left a legacy no empire could match. The certainty that the invisible one can be heard, followed and trusted. Time passed, centuries raced by, but his name never died. The story of Abraham lives on in every man and woman who dares to take a step of faith, even when the path is not fully visible, because the God who called him still calls today. The God of Abraham among the nations. The name of Abraham crossed generations, becoming more than just a family memory for the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael. He became a spiritual landmark that united peoples as different as they were distant. In every culture that heard his story, the echo of the promise took on new meaning, as if heaven had opened a unique path for all people in some way to call him their father. Among the Jews, Abraham is remembered as the father of Israel, the man who received from God the promise of land, descendants, and blessing in the sacred scrolls. He is the first to cross the unknown by faith, the first to build altars to the invisible God. In their feasts, prayers, and traditions, Abraham lives on as the patriarch of the covenant that centuries later would give birth to the people of Israel. Christians call him the father of faith. In the letters of the apostles and the gospels, he is remembered as the example of one who believed when nothing seemed possible. To the followers of Christ, Abraham is more than a distant ancestor. He is the model of grace, the man who was justified not by works but by trusting in the voice of God. The promise he received according to Christians was not only for Israel but for all nations fulfilled in Jesus, the promised descendant among Muslims. Abraham is revered as Ibram, the friend of God, the father of the Arab peoples through Ishmael. The Quran describes him as a prophet, a man of integrity who rejected idols and proclaimed faith in the one God. Allah. In every pilgrimage to Mecca, in every prayer of the faithful, the name of Ibram is honored as the one who initiated true submission to God. 3 peoples, 3 traditions, 3 paths that despite their differences find in Abraham a common point. He is the link between heaven and earth, the man whose calling echoes among Jews, Christians, and Muslims as a symbol of faith that crosses all boundaries. Scholars throughout the centuries have recorded how Abraham's name remains alive in liturgies, sacred texts, and stories told around the world. In Jerusalem, the stones still carry the weight of the promise. In Mecca, millions bow remembering the father of Ishmael. In churches, synagogues, and mosques, Abraham is mentioned as the man who heard and obeyed the God no one could see. Time, which erases names and destroys legacies, has not silenced his story. The God of Abraham is invoked today in hundreds of languages, worshipped by peoples who have never met, proclaimed on continents. Abraham never walked, and in every heart that dares to believe without seeing, the same God continues to call, leave your land. Walk by faith. Believe in the invisible. The God of Abraham still walks among the nations. The heaven that forgets no name. Time has carried on like a river that never returns to its starting point. Kingdoms have risen and fallen. Peoples have scattered. Languages have multiplied. But heaven has remained the same. The name of Abraham, which once echoed in the silence of the Chaldeans, has continued to cross centuries and borders. It was not trapped in the desert nor buried with his descendants. The name of that simple man who dared to listen to a voice no one else could hear became a bridge between heaven and earth. But Abraham's story does not belong only to the past, because the same God who called him by name still calls in every generation. He continues to whisper in the silence of the night. He continues to break traditions, challenge securities, stir hearts. Heaven continues to search for those who, like Abraham, are willing to take the first step, even without knowing where the path will lead. You who are reading or listening to this story, you are not outside of that call. Perhaps you live surrounded by the familiar, surrounded by voices telling you what you should be, do, or dream. Perhaps like Abraham you sense there is something beyond what the eyes can see, an invisible invitation, a promise greater than you ever dared to believe. Heaven still calls by name, not by titles, achievements, or the masks the world imposes, but by the name written in eternity before you were even born. Abraham was called, he answered, and because of one simple yes, the world was never the same. Heaven still calls. Today, right now, you are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are not too far gone. The same God who walked among the stars, the same one who visited tents in Canaan, the same one who opened the womb of a barren woman, the same one who provided at the last moment, he still calls. Heaven forgets no name. And maybe, just maybe, it's your turn to answer. Hey, don't stop now. New stories are already waiting for you. Click on one of the videos on your screen and keep diving into the hidden revelations of the Bible. Having you with us until this moment has been a true honor. What a joy to share every detail of this journey with you. If this message spoke to your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share it with someone special who also needs to hear these truths. See you in the next episode. May the Lord watch over you and guide your every step. Until then.